Okay, we're going to continue. We're going to North America. Okay. Astrid is okay. Okay, yes, as you see, I'm trying to be very strict with times to allow you time to discuss and all that. So now we're gonna see kind of the tradition of translocations of the United States. Our main speaker was Mike Phillips. I'm gonna explain you something about Mike Phillips. He's a very interesting character. I mean, he has the basic training of a wildlife manager. I mean, with the typical scientific training, and he worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, for the American government, with that tradition of working in a government. But then he moved, and you will see in his presentation, to Turner, I think Turner Endangered Species Fund, to working in a big NGO. So he has the perspective of a wildlife manager who worked in the government, and then now who works in an NGO. And also he's a congressman, you will see. So he's an official politician. He's an elected politician. So he knows how to work in the world of legislation, making deals, and you will see that. So I think that's a very interesting perspective. And you will see his style of conversation. The bad thing is he couldn't come, but he prepared a very good video that was 1 hour and 40 minutes. So we edited it. No, don't laugh too much. No, but it's more than 1 hour now. So we took away like 20%, but you will see the guy, I mean, because he's very good in communication. So we're going to start with him. Then the idea is to move to Charles Littnam. Littnam, yeah. Charles worked for 2 decades with the Hawaii Monk Seal project, which is a historic success. I remember reading in the Félix de Rodríguez de la Fuente articles about the Hawaiian monk seal, and it was going to hell, like it happened with the Caribbean monk seal that went extinct, but it has recovered. So it's a good story, like the Iberian lynx. And something important is, well, his government. That's also interesting because you're going to see people from NGOs and people from government. Is that there's very few experiences of translocations with marine mammals. So Charles is also the president of the Society for Marine Mammals. That would be or something like that. And he's trying to tell the people who work with marine mammals, hey guys, this can be done. It isn't something exotic, because there's lots of resistance in the marine mammal world to handle and to manage marine mammals. So I think just having an example from that world I think is a great asset to this conversation. And then if we have time, I think it's good to give a space to Astrid, so she can talk about the black-footed ferret, which is a classic example of the endangered species recovery program with a critically endangered species. And probably she can connect that with the Iberian lynx. So I'm gonna leave you with Mike Phillips.
You going ready? Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Let me start by thanking Ignacio for letting me participate by video. I had hoped to attend in person, but circumstances got in the way. I envy your ability to participate in person. I think the next couple of days are going to prove to be time very well spent. To that end, what I aim to do with this video is summarize my history with conservation translocations with comments on the successes and failures that I've been part of and the challenges that I've encountered over about the last 40 years. I am going to offer some detailed comments about the historic effort to restore gray wolves to western Colorado. Also, because of Ignacio's curiosity, I'm going to provide some thoughts about the status of the wolf restoration work in Yellowstone National Park. And finally, I'm going to conclude with, I think, 4 admonitions that I think are important for conservation translocation practitioners like you and me and others. Before going any further, I want to thank Grizzly Creek Films here in Bozeman, Montana. They graciously agreed to help me produce this video. If you guys ever want to make a film in the United States, you can't go wrong with Grizzly Creek in Bozeman, Montana. Since I don't know many of you and you don't know me, I thought it was important to address a central question. Why would anyone, why would Ignacio, for example, consider me a reintroduction maestro? First, let me note that I am a reintroduction practitioner by active choice since 1986, but my interest in being a wildlife biologist goes all the way back to 1970 when I saw a National Geographic special that portrayed the pioneering work of Frank and John Craighead in Yellowstone National Park. And I said to myself, as a 12-year-old boy, I want to do that. That decision on my part led to undergraduate studies in ecology. Those studies led to an opportunity to work as a field biologist on Dave Meach's pioneering study of gray wolves and their prey in the Superior National Forest of northeastern Minnesota. The image that you're seeing, the left-hand portion, that's me standing with a clipboard over the first gray wolf that I captured for research purposes in the summer of 1980. Following that, I was able to secure a graduate position at the University of Alaska Fairbanks studying the impacts of oil and gas development on grizzly bears in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Following that, I was honored to serve as a Rotary Fellow that provided me the opportunity to conduct the first ever study of red foxes and dingoes in the Naji Nature Reserve of southeastern Australia. Following that, I was highly honored. I was honored to be selected as the first recovery leader for the red wolf restoration effort that was conducted in the southeastern United States, specifically Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge. That project was significant for many reasons, not the least of which is that it represented the first attempt in the history of mankind to restore a carnivore species that had been declared extinct in the wild. The picture on the left is me and the refuge manager, the Alligator River National Wildlife Refuge manager, and of course the image in the lower right corner is simply a portrayal of the red wolf Canis rufus. The red wolf program set the stage for me to be honored to serve as the first leader of the Yellowstone Wolf Restoration Project that began in earnest in 1995. This is a picture of me leading Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt. Not long after the Yellowstone Project began, I had the unique opportunity to meet Ted Turner. And Ted's interest and enthusiasm for conservation of wild places and wild things, along with 3 wolves that I had come to know very well, created an opportunity of a lifetime to form a whole new organization that would give rise to a new approach of using conservation translocations to redress the extinction crisis. Specifically, Ted and I came together in June of 1997, and we co-founded the Turner Endangered Species Fund and Turner Biodiversity Divisions that aim to use reintroductions to redress the biodiversity crisis and illustrate, beyond doubt, that private land and private assets could be used to create beachheads of security for rare and vanishing species. Beyond my work as a field biologist, I've been fortunate to serve in the Montana State Legislature for 14 years, both in the Montana House of Representatives and the Montana Senate. As an elected official, I had good opportunity to contribute to a conservation translocation project of note that focused on the greater sage-grouse. The long history of conservation translocation in the United States actually began with a focus on game species. Indeed, in the 1940s, Aldo Leopold is purported to have opined that the science of wildlife management grew out of a need for things to shoot. By the 1920s, 1930s, the great game populations of the United States had been decimated by hunters. The game populations had been decimated. Much of the overuse was due to lax legal protections for the species in question and a misguided but widely held belief that it was our country's manifest destiny to subdue wild places and wild things. Fortunately, by the 1930s and 1940s, states had begun, and the federal government had begun to respond to the crisis by passing legislation that enabled restoration efforts, many of which required reintroductions or conservation translocations, on behalf of species that had utilitarian value, like the elk that you see in this slide, mule deer, white-tailed deer, turkeys, bobwhite quail, all were the beneficiaries of great restoration efforts. These efforts typically quite successful, and by the 1960s and 1970s, these game populations had been well restored across the United States, with one exception. One exception. The American plains bison simply got left behind. It is a sad and tragic history of the conservation work in this country that the American plains bison, the 6 animals that you see in this slide, American plains bison got left behind. I find it so sad that the greatest assemblage of mammalian biomass the world has probably ever seen, that being the American plains bison, has been functionally extinct for many, many years. And honestly, folks, there's really no change, as I see it, no change in the species' future. You didn't see a shift in the direction of imperiled species until passage of the Endangered Species Act in 1973. The fund and the divisions are founded on keen collaboration and the principles of conservation biology. We focus on imperiled carnivores, plant pollinator complexes, native species that include Turner lands, and dissemination of credible scientific and policy information about biodiversity conservation. Our ultimate aim is to restore populations that are self-sufficient and contribute to regional or national recovery objectives. In other words, we aim to operate at scale. Because we chose to focus on imperiled species, of course, with reduced ranges, of course, conservation translocations are central to our work. And during the last 25 years, we've led or have been actively involved in 19 reintroduction projects to benefit 14 species of plants, birds, fishes, mammals, amphibians, reptiles, and one invertebrate. Our work has taken place all across the United States, from the pine forests of the southeastern United States. The picture that you see is of Mr. Turner's Nonami plantation in Georgia. We've worked in the southeast. We worked in the great grasslands of the Great Plains, the montane rangelands of Montana, and the sky island and desert habitats of the southwest. By working hard over the last 25 years, we have recorded some historic successes, and we've had some failures too. That by itself is significant. When we started, we were not sure that we would have any successes or any failures, because when we started, no one had ever done what we intended. In this country, imperiled species work is guided by really the Federal Endangered Species Act. The slide that you see is just the front cover of the law. Imperiled species work in the United States is largely a governmental affair, either a federal government or a federal agency like the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, or a state government operating through an agency like Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Because of the technical expertise and legal aspects of imperiled species restoration through reintroductions, it's hard to imagine any other way. It's hard to imagine any way other than a governmental approach. But Ted and I imagined that there would be another way, that we could develop sufficient technical expertise, that we could handle the legal burdens of imperiled species restoration through reintroductions through active collaborations with the federal government. Ted is singularly unique. At the core of Ted Turner is an outdoor guy. He has a keen affinity for the out of doors and a keen affinity for the underdog. That is what prompted him to methodically assemble the greatest roster of private wildlands in the world, stretching across over 2 million acres that include a dizzying array of ecological settings from the southeastern United States to the Rocky Mountains to the desert Southwest and in South America too. That said, I personally have been involved in failures related to conservation translocations and successes, and there's instruction from both. The first failure has to be, I must sadly say, the Red Wolf Restoration Project in the southeastern United States. Here is a colleague of mine back in probably 1989, an outstanding field biologist by the name of Jennifer Dagan, letting a red wolf go. We let a lot of animals go, and some did really well, but they all failed because of one problem. The red wolf has this keen, persistent predilection to hybridize with coyotes. And even in the presence of intensive management, it has proven very, very difficult to keep the level of hybridization to an acceptable level. I would have you believe, sadly, I must report, that in my estimation, the Red Wolf Recovery Program is on looser footing today, less certain footing today than when I began that work in 1986. It might rise up from the ashes and be ultimately successful. I fear not. And I think the take-home message is, despite all the king's horses and all the king's men, sometimes Humpty Dumpty can't be put back together again. It may be that the coyote is so widely distributed now in the United States, and the red wolf's predilection to hybridize with coyotes is so persistent that there simply is no way to restore the red wolf. The failures that let me say, before Turner, the one great success I was involved with was the Yellowstone National Park project. It proceeded from day one with a great deal of certainty. We were always ahead of schedule and under budget. And the habitat was so suitable that you can make a case that Doug Smith and I didn't need to release any more than the first 14 wolves in what would have been 1995. We did release 17 additional animals from Canada, and then 10 puppies from Montana got caught up in the excitement too. But the fact is, it worked so very well that we probably didn't need more than the first 14. It has been a restoration project of epic successes. And I would have you believe now, over 25 years later, as two easily understood metrics of success, probably over 750 puppies have been born, and over 50 packs have arisen and done what wolf packs do. The Yellowstone Project is a phenomenal success. At Team Turner, the Turner Endangered Species Fund and Turner Biodiversity Divisions, we've had some failures. We failed with the black-footed ferret. In the upper left-hand corner of this slide, you'll see a black-footed ferret on the short grass prairie of Vermejo Park Ranch, Mr. Turner's property in north-central New Mexico. We failed with black-footed ferrets there because we were unable to restore and maintain sufficient distribution of prairie dogs. For those of you that don't know, the black-footed ferret is an obligate carnivore on prairie dogs. They are absolutely dependent upon prairie dogs. Matter of fact, if you were to design an endangered species, you would design a black-footed ferret. We failed with ferrets on the short grass prairie because of drought. Drought precipitated, we believe, by increasing concentrations of heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere, in other words, climate change. Similarly, the lower left-hand image is of an Aplomado falcon. We let a good number of falcons go in close collaboration with the Peregrine Fund and the United States Fish and Wildlife Service at Mr. Turner's Armendaris Ranch in central New Mexico, and the birds just disappeared. Over 100 birds released. No evidence of their presence not long after release. We suspect they all died, and we suspect they all died because of a lack of prey. Aplomados rely heavily on insects, grasshoppers, for example. And we think the prey populations were insufficient to support Aplomado falcons because of drought, because of climate change. We failed with the Mexican wolf program. Now, that wasn't something we were leading. That's a federal program, but we were actively involved. And for years, as you'll understand more clearly soon when I talk about the Colorado effort, we pushed the Fish and Wildlife Service hard with the best available science to get the federal government to recognize for Canis lupus bailey to be recovered through conservation translocations. They had to push the program north into southern Colorado and southern Utah. Ultimately, as I'll explain soon, the federal government decided otherwise. We failed with the Swift Fox project. In the lower right corner, those are two Swift Fox kits, one of which is playing with a prairie vole that you see flying in the air. We failed with the Swift Fox project because of a tragic death. This is Kevin Hannes, a very talented young field biologist who was our principal investigator for the Swift Fox restoration effort. That's Kevin with an adult fox. Kevin died tragically due to a boating accident. And I mentioned that, one, as a shout out to my good pal who I miss on a daily basis, and to point out that sometimes projects will require just that special person. There was no way for me to keep the Swift Fox project going, absent Kevin. We have tried to find value in our failures. I'm compelled by this phrase from a Swahili warrior song that you can see in the slide. Life has meaning only in the struggle. Triumph or defeat is in the hands of the gods. So let us celebrate the struggle. We have celebrated our struggles because there is great instruction there. Fortunately, our successes are far more common than our failures, and they instruct too. We've had great success with the gopher tortoise, the animal depicted in the lower left-hand portion of this slide. We have successfully translocated nearly 600 gopher tortoises to Ted's Avalon Plantation in northern Florida. These were animals that would otherwise have been buried alive under a parking lot, for example, legally buried alive. And we said, no, not on our watch, are we going to have animals buried alive. And imagine now, a gopher tortoise can live underground for an extended period, but he can't dig out through a parking lot. Had we not stepped in, these animals would have died a most miserable death. We've had great success with our red-cockaded woodpecker conservation translocation program. You can see a bird on the right-hand side flying into its cavity. Red-cockaded woodpeckers, affectionately known as RCWs, are the only woodpecker in the world that creates cavities in live trees. They are deeply committed to that cavity. Absent an ability to get in their cavity, that RCW will not live for a night or two before falling prey to something like an owl. We conducted the biggest, most successful conservation translocations of RCWs in history. What made it so unique, the forest that we took the birds to was well within the historic range of the species, but the original forest had long since been cut down. A new forest had grown up. The birds had left, they had never come back. None of the trees had these critically important cavities. So to start, we had to provide all the cavities for all of the trees. No one had ever attempted to restore RCWs to a forest that had never before supported the species. It has been wildly successful ever since. We're hoping soon the population will grow to a size where the United States Fish and Wildlife Service can remove birds to advance recovery efforts elsewhere in the species' historical range in the southeastern United States. We've had great success with black-footed ferrets. Even though I said we failed with ferrets on Vermejo's shortgrass prairie, we have access to other settings for black-footed ferrets. And we are poised to contribute mightily to black-footed ferret recovery, which is significant in our minds. Black-footed ferrets are arguably the rarest carnivore in the world. We've had great success learning how to restore prairie dog populations. We have translocated, for conservation purposes, over 15,000 prairie dogs to build habitat for the black-footed ferret. Great success we've also had a big challenge with these two species that I'll speak to in just a moment. We've had tremendous success making clear that gray wolves, as you see on the left-hand side of this slide, fit a wild working landscape like Mr. Turner's ranches, especially if the livestock that's being ranched is American plains bison, as you see here. Gray wolves do not disrupt ranching, and they do not disrupt the big game hunting opportunities on Mr. Turner's ranches. They fit the wild working landscapes quite well. We intend to make everyone aware that gray wolves are not the big boogeyman that they're made out to be. Quite the contrary. We have years and years of data that show they fit wild working landscapes quite well. We've had tremendous success with our trout program. When we finish this year or next, we will have restored imperiled cutthroat trout, specifically West Slope cutthroat trout in Montana and Rio Grande cutthroat trout in New Mexico, to over 250 miles of streams and creeks in the Rocky Mountain West. That's a scale of work that a state or federal government is challenged to achieve. Both of these species are critically imperiled. They both have been petitioned for listing under federal law under the Endangered Species Act. So far, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has denied those petitions, in part because of the success of conservation translocations by Team Turner. We have had tremendous success with our desert bighorn sheep restoration project. You can see in the left-hand slide, or left-hand picture of this slide, some rams that we were releasing back in 1995. Releases in 95 and again in 98, a total of about, if memory serves, 37 animals, gave rise to the largest, most productive bighorn sheep population in the state of New Mexico by 2011. In the fall of 11, New Mexico Department of Game and Fish came to the mountains and they removed 17 adult ewes, reproductively active, critically important ewes, to advance restoration of bighorns elsewhere in the state of New Mexico. That's our first success at restoring a donor population, a population of animals that is secure enough and big enough to donate animals to restoration work elsewhere. For us, restoring donor populations is a gold standard of success. We achieved it with desert bighorn sheep. We're on the cusp of achieving it with red cockaded woodpeckers in the southeastern United States. We've had, even though I said we failed with the Mexican wolf, on the other hand, we've succeeded. Our captive breeding and pre-release facility is a cornerstone, as I said, of the federal recovery effort. We are proud that animals that we have tended have found their way to the wilds of Mexico. That, for us, is a success. We are quite proud of our successful effort on behalf of the bolson tortoise, a species that was not known to science before the late 1950s. Our captive breeding and restoration program is the only one of its kind in the entire world. We are the only game in town for the critically imperiled gopher tortoise. We started with fewer than 30 adults, and through very careful, methodical work to perfect husbandry techniques and captive breeding, we now count a captive population that recorded in 2021 its 500th hatchling. We now have more than a sufficient captive population to properly support conservation translocations to suitable habitat, which we began at the Armendaris Ranch in 2021. Now, why the two pictures on this slide? Well, the upper left-hand corner is a little bitty tortoise. A little bitty tortoise is known in 09DW1. 09DW1 was the first bolson tortoise born in the wild in the United States in over 10,000 years. The species has been extinct in the United States since the late Pleistocene. The picture on the right, that's 09DW1 last summer. We've had tremendous success and will continue to work hard to ensure a secure future for the bolson tortoise. We have had challenges, as I mentioned. We've been challenged by climate change. It gave the blues to Oplomato falcons, as I spoke to, and you can see a falcon there. We have been challenged by predation. Cougars, as you see the middle image in the slide, cougars have been hard on reintroduced bighorn sheep. We have killed cougars to make room for naive bighorn sheep. We have killed a lot of coyotes to make room for naive swift fox. We have killed a lot of brook trout to make room for cutthroat trout. The brook trout will prey on cutthroats. We've been challenged by diseases. Let me back up to predation. The right-hand image of the slide is a big bullfrog. And bullfrogs are not the least bit shy about eating Chiricahua leopard frogs, a program that we have invested heavily in. Predation for us has been a problem. We typically address the problem of predation by trying to reduce the numbers of predators. We killed cougars, we killed coyotes, we killed bullfrogs. We haven't figured out a real good, effective redress for climate change. We've been challenged by diseases. Sylvatic plague, for example, is really the big obstacle to black-footed ferret recovery because it kills a lot of prairie dogs. When plague gets into a colony, it wipes it nearly completely out. That's a problem for ferrets because it's wiping out its sustenance, and plague will kill ferrets too. We're working with the United States Fish and Wildlife Service on developing a technique for keeping plague at arm's length at scale, largely by controlling the number of fleas. Fleas are the principal vector for the disease. We kill fleas, we should be able to keep the disease, sylvatic plague, on its heels. We've been challenged, as I said, by hybridization. We had to remove a lot of rainbow trout because they will hybridize with cutthroat trout, for example. So we have had our fair share of challenges, and we're working hard to overcome some. We are admittedly a bit befuddled by climate change, although we are addressing that by imagining moving species to new habitats that might fall outside their historical range, and I'll have something to say about that momentarily. We have been challenged by political problems. Now, this slide might not mean much to you, but it was a slide that was put out by a fellow by the name of John. Well, the slide portrays two pictures of political ads that were put out by John Thune. John Thune was a Republican running for the United States Senate in South Dakota against a Democrat known as Tom Daschle. Senator Daschle was at the time the senior Democrat in the United States Senate, a well-established incumbent. It's very hard to beat an incumbent. Early on, the political pundits had Daschle winning re-election handily, even though John Thune was a very attractive candidate for South Dakota. Conventional wisdom would have you believe he couldn't get past Daschle. Toward the end of the campaign, what helped Thune considerably was an advertising effort that made clear that Tom Daschle liked prairie dogs. The prairie dogs are lining up to vote for Tom Daschle. You shouldn't vote for Tom Daschle because he likes prairie dogs. That is clear evidence that some of our work has been challenged by political forces. In this particular case, who could dislike prairie dogs more, John Thune or Tom Daschle? And Tom Daschle was no friend of prairie dogs, mind you. Just John Thune wanted the voters to think that he was, with the kinds of ads that you see on the screen here. We've been challenged by politics. We've been challenged by misinformation and hatred. The image on the left of the slide, beware, Mexican wolves are killing our elk. Mexican wolves don't kill enough elk to make a difference to the recreational hunter, but there is a lot of effort to perpetuate that myth. And then, of course, wolf recovery is hamstrung by just outright hatred. Anyone that knows the history of the United States can appreciate what the hoods on the fellas in the right-hand image, what those hoods mean. They mean ugly hatred. And the irony of this picture, standing behind an American flag with a gray wolf being held up, they probably killed that wolf legally. Not that it makes it right necessarily, but still they chose to portray the killing in the most ugly and violent of ways. We have been challenged by hatred. We've been challenged by a lack of imagination. on the part of the federal government and state governments, and this is our principal response to climate change. You can imagine moving species to new areas where they've never occurred. You can imagine the Mexican wolf going north to habitats it might not have occupied in the recent past. You can imagine actually looking to instruction from deep time. We know, for example, that the Bolson tortoise actually occupied much of the southwestern United States during the Pleistocene. And as time passed, the range contracted to Mexico. So many people have you believe, oh, gee whiz, Mike, the Bolson tortoise is not a native species, it's an exotic. Well, sure, if you consider everything started in 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, which is typically the year that we start the historic range clock. But why not 1491? Why not 1490? Why not deep time as a source of instruction for restoration work? We have been pushing hard to point out that sometimes thinking outside the box, being imaginative, is a way to secure a future for some of these species, especially those that are being principally challenged by climate change.
Audio? Okay, now the talks gets into the second half, and it's focused on wolf, not because wolves are especially important or we should be obsessed about the wolves, because they present particular challenges. And what you're going to see, and I think is particularly important, is the importance of politics and managing politics well. And that here, as translocation practitioners, who typically we have a scientific or technical training, and we tend to be worried about anesthetics, diseases, health screening, radio tagging, there's another tool which is a political campaign, and it went away. So just to open our minds of the needs and the potential to advance conservation translocations that are really, really challenging politically, and how you can use different techniques. So you're going to see this case at depth because it's really groundbreaking what you're going to see.
Our most audacious effort, which is a great success, with a host of challenges, began in 1995 and aimed to restore the gray wolf to the great, highly suitable public wildlands of western Colorado. It achieved a watershed moment at 7:01 p.m. on Tuesday, November 3rd, 2020, as captured by the 11 powerful words that you see on the screen. Be it enacted by the people of the state of Colorado. To appreciate the power of those words, we need to go back to 1995 when Ted and I set out to advance recovery of the Mexican wolf by restoring the subspecies to the southern Rockies ecoregion of northern New Mexico and western Colorado that also included his 585,000 acre or thereabouts Vermejo Park Ranch. We were deeply committed to recovery of Canis lupus bailey, the most imperiled subspecies of gray wolf in the world. We were compelled in part because of what you see in front of you now. The image on the left is simply the United States. The green in the northern part of the North American continent is occupied habitat in Canada and Alaska. If you look at the light green of the continental United States, the small circles depict, and the slide is admittedly a bit dated, but they depict where gray wolves occur today. They actually are more widespread in the northern Rocky Mountains than this image would depict, but you get the point. The point is, when you look to western Colorado, it's that long, red-hatched area. That is the southern Rockies ecoregion, and it is unoccupied. It was then when we made this slide. It is today, and it is defined by vast tracts of federal public lands, as depicted in the right-hand portion of this slide. Bureau of Land Management property, United States Forest Service property. There is well over 20 million acres of highly suitable habitat, mostly federal public lands, and some strategically located private lands where the gray wolf would receive priority consideration. It is a gold mine of opportunity for the Mexican wolf. It also happens to include Turner's Vermejo Park Ranch, which by itself, at nearly 1,000 square miles, by itself, given the abundance of prey, could support 50, 60, 70, 80 wolves all by itself. This compelled us so much so that we spent years assembling all of the relevant science. Mostly what you see here are peer-reviewed publications, but to make life easy for folks, we also assembled a compendium, a book, that put everything one would need to know about restoring gray wolves, the Mexican gray wolf, for example, to the Southern Rockies ecoregion of western Colorado. In other words, we did exactly what you'd expect for us to do. We did the assembly of the best available science. And we bumped into this problem. When you look at all of the data, historical remains, contemporary data on movements and genetics and ecology, there is a solid science-based argument for the Mexican wolf recovery region extending itself into southern Colorado and the southern part of Utah. In other words, connecting itself to the great potential of the Southern Rockies ecoregion where we were working and the great potential of the Grand Canyon ecoregion of northern Arizona and northern Utah. That was the vision that we were perpetuating based on the best available science. Why does it matter? Here's why it matters. This map depicts the state of Chihuahua in Mexico. And all of those polygons that you see in various colors represent different owners. The biggest polygon is an ejido. Ejidos are communal lands owned by a collection of private individuals, but still fundamentally private land. What you don't see in the state of Chihuahua, or anywhere in Mexico for that matter, are big tracts of public lands. You're not going to tear up gates needlessly. How do you work across a landscape that is defined by a vast number of different landowners that may all have different objectives in advancing wolf recovery? It is an untenable landscape to advance wolf recovery, especially when you acknowledge at the beginning of any restoration effort of gray wolves that involve conservation translocations, the animals need to be intensively managed to promote population growth. You can't just let them go and forget about them. How do you work across this landscape? And oh, by the way, be mindful, there is a persistent illegal drug presence throughout all of this country. How do you keep your field crews safe? It is an untenable ownership pattern. That's why moving north into the Southern Rockies ecoregion of Colorado or the Grand Canyon ecoregion of Arizona and Utah was so critically important to the Mexican wolf. I go back to this slide again. You can see all of those public lands of western Colorado. You can see how western Colorado, once populated, serves as this archstone connecting wolves from the high Arctic all the way to the Mexican border. It's a motherlode of opportunity for the Mexican wolf. Because of this, we not only assembled the great science, we built on purpose in the early 2000s a restoration stool. We said, what would it take to support a successful restoration project that relied on conservation translocations? We said, well, the stool should have three legs of support. The first is the leg of advocacy. People that are so excited, they're in the parking lot with a bullhorn speaking the magic of the Mexican wolf. That was the Southern Rockies Wolf Restoration Project. It was a collection of conservation organizations that would advocate on behalf of the Mexican wolf. The second leg of this restoration stool was the leg of education. And that leg was populated by the Denver Zoo, the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo, the Pueblo Zoo, the zoo in Albuquerque, and the International Wolf Center. These were serious, effective conservation education organizations that said to whomever was interested, if you have an important opinion about wolf restoration that is presented respectfully and based on reliable information, we will help you get that perspective out. They weren't making a decision about what's right or wrong. We'll help you move information forward. They were operating on the simple belief that good people need good information to make good decisions. And the third leg of this restoration stool was the leg of research and monitoring, and that was the Southern Rockies Wolf Monitoring and Research Team, consisted of groups like the United States Geological Survey, the Conservation Biology Department of the Denver Zoo, the Turner Endangered Species Fund, and some other colleagues of mine that are top shelf research scientists. We built this stool upon which one could rest restoration of the Mexican wolf to the Southern Rockies ecoregion of western Colorado. And we failed. we failed miserably. Years and years and years of work, really good work, and we failed. And how did the failure manifest itself? Why do I show you this map again? We failed at convincing the United States Fish and Wildlife Service to move the Mexican wolf recovery program north. So right now, what you see is the area that they will focus on at least through 2027 or 2028. They have chosen to memorialize what I call the southern option. The United States Fish and Wildlife Service is advancing Mexican wolf recovery via the southern option, which is central Arizona and central New Mexico, south into Mexico, walking away completely from the northern option, which happens to contain an abundance of highly suitable habitat for the Mexican wolf. We failed, but we didn't give up. we simply retooled, right? Well, okay, we failed that way, but we're not done. If our aim is to restore gray wolves to the Southern Rockies ecoregion, western Colorado, and we can't achieve it with Canis lupus bailey with the help of the federal government, how else can we do it? We can build a political campaign. And we can force the state of Colorado into the deep end of the restoration pool through a vote. Now, if you back up, you could say, well, Mike, couldn't gray wolves come to occupy western Colorado on their own? I'll speak to that. The answer is no. Could you do it illegally? Well, the answer is sure, we could do it illegally, but I really don't want to get caught translocating gray wolves illegally, so let's walk away from the illegal option. Couldn't the state of Colorado do it? You bet. I don't know of any state that would willingly grab hold of wolf recovery and do it on their own. They almost certainly are going to have to be pushed. They're going to have to be pushed into the restoration pool. There's only one entity that can push a government to action. And of course, that entity is the electors, the voters of the state of Colorado, for example, in this particular case. So here's what we did. I knew, by 2014, the federal government was not going to bring the Mexican wolf to Colorado, even though without doing that, the Mexican wolf, in my estimation, is doomed to fail. The Mexican wolf recovery program is doomed to failure. But that's the federal government's choice. So, and it was obvious to me in 2014. So we built out what was called the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project. It was an educational effort that aimed to give rise to good information, to sort of do the spade work, to prepare Coloradans for a vote. It was an effort, it being the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, to bring people together that could eventually stay together through a campaign. And we went forward, giving rise to the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project as ostensibly an educational effort. And it was, but it had a big play in mind. And you might say, well, Mike, why were you so convinced of this? Why were you convinced that it would work? We knew from public opinion surveys that Coloradans were over the moon supportive of wolves being restored. That's the bar graph on the left-hand side. No matter how you slice and dice the data, Coloradans say yes to gray wolves in big numbers. Vast majority says yes to gray wolves. We knew that the Southern Rockies ecoregion of western Colorado supported a unheard of abundance of ungulate biomass, of prey for the gray wolf. Indeed, I am convinced that western Colorado represents the best unoccupied wolf habitat in the world, in part because public land occupied by large numbers of deer and elk. We knew there was this seductive piece to this whole vision. When you look at the Southern Rockies ecoregion, it is the middle. And we said to conservation visionaries, if we can plug the middle, if we can use the Southern Rockies properly, it is the archstone connecting gray wolves from the high Arctic to the Mexican border. If you can restore gray wolves to western Colorado, you will have finished the job of recreating a metapopulation, a population of populations of gray wolves from the high Arctic to the Mexican border. There is no other place in the world where you can imagine the restoration of a large, much maligned, misunderstood carnivore across such a continental landscape. That is seductive restoration ecology of the finest kind, and it did attract conservation visionaries. So we built a campaign, and the first step was to produce video that would inspire. The next three, they're short videos. I'm going to show you these. These are all done by Grizzly Creek Films in Bozeman, Montana. I'm so very proud. The first two are award-winning pieces. Let me see if I can get this to work.
There's a chorus we sing here in this place, Colorado. It rings from the Maroon Bells to Mile High. From the great sand dunes to the highest town in America. In the birthplace of rodeo and the cheeseburger, where snowmelt flows into every glass. We hear it floating on the breeze above red rocks, or drifting way out into the backcountry where the wild things roam, and the air hums with life. It's our anthem to freedom. But listen carefully. One voice has gone missing. A note that rang through our mountains for eons has disappeared. Help us return this voice to Colorado.
So that video entitled Chorus of Colorado aimed to inspire, and we think that Grizzly Creek did a magnificent job doing just that. But we also knew that as important as data are, people aren't motivated by data. They're motivated by good stories. And so we work with Glenn Close and Grizzly Creek Films to develop this video, which we think tells a compelling story.
Everyone loves a good story. One of our favorite characters is the big bad wolf. But what if our fairy tales don't get it right? Think of a mother wolf. She's not interested in huffing and puffing and blowing your house down. She needs to find her own home. If her pack comes across Little Red Riding Hood in the woods, she'd make sure that her family keeps their distance and avoids conflict. Her life is full of hardship. Less than 10% of hunts are successful. Life expectancies are low. Our stories created a monster. These myths drove us to fear the wolf. By the 1950s, a population of almost 500,000 in the lower 48 was nearly exterminated, and more was lost than just the wolf. You can't pull a character without changing the whole plot. Remove wolves, and herd numbers can explode, rivers can erode. How wrong our narrative has been. In 1973, on the brink of extinction, wolves were one of the first animals to gain protection under the U.S. Endangered Species Act. We'd begun to understand the truth. Wolves don't attack. They avoid us. Cattle are many times more likely to be killed by bad weather than by wolves. the wolf is making a comeback. They're tracing the shores of the Great Lakes, climbing the northern Rockies, roaming the Southwest, but there's a missing link. The reintroduction of wolves to Colorado would restore the natural balance. It's time for a new chapter.
All of those videos really aim to educate in a most compelling manner. As we built the education campaign on the backbone of the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, we did not deny any of the tough issues. We addressed, for example, as you can see from this slide, we addressed head-on the issue of wolves and livestock. And we said, well, we know gray wolves kill livestock, but we know it's the atypical wolf that kills livestock. We know that most gray wolves don't. We know that most ranchers will never suffer any losses. We know that wolf depredations in livestock do not represent a threat to the industry because they are so very uncommon. And we know when problems do arise, we have very effective techniques for resolving a problem and very effective techniques for preventing problems from happening in the first place. Wolf-livestock interactions is no reason why to oppose wolf recovery in the state of Colorado. We addressed head-on this issue of wolves and big game. Some would have you believe, oh my gosh, gray wolves decimate big game populations. Well, no, they don't. No, they don't. As a matter of fact, gray wolves struggle to kill big game. Most hunts by gray wolves are failures. 7, 8 times out of 10, they come up empty-pawed. And please know, when I speak about the natural history of the gray wolf, please know it is one of the most studied large mammals in the world. We said, quite simply, the best science makes clear, if you want gray wolves in western Colorado, you got to put them in a shipping crate, like this animal is, take them to the state of Colorado, and let them go on purpose. We knew that all of this would take a lot of money. So a central part of the campaign was fundraising. I show you this slide of me with 5 dear friends, conservation visionaries. They all happen to be women. It was women at the beginning that embraced this vision of restoration on purpose through direct democracy in Colorado. These 5 women that I show raised over $500,000 to advance the campaign to restore gray wolves to western Colorado through the ballot box, through direct democracy, through conservation translocations. All of this gave rise, this good foundational work that was the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project, gave rise to the political campaign that aimed to elect a candidate. In this particular case, we weren't interested in electing a person. We were interested in electing an idea, the idea of restoring the gray wolf to western Colorado through conservation translocations. The organization that would run that campaign, when it got right down to it, was a lean, mean, fighting political machine known as the Rocky Mountain Wolf Action Fund. That is what the Rocky Mountain Wolf Project gave rise to. The Action Fund did one thing. It developed Proposition 114. In the state of Colorado, citizens can come together and say, we believe in this idea so much, we want it to appear on a ballot so everybody can vote. If the proposition passes, it immediately becomes law. It doesn't need any help from the legislature. It doesn't need any help from a governor. The citizens have the right to develop their own laws through an initiative process. That's what led to Proposition 114, being enacted by the people of the state of Colorado that the Wildlife Commission shall restore wolves. That's fundamentally what Proposition 114 said. In order for this proposition to actually appear on a ballot, you had to convince the state government, specifically the Secretary of State, that there was widespread support for the idea, so much so that she would put it on the ballot. In other words, you had to successfully petition for this proposition to meet a certain threshold of interest as manifest by signatures collected so that the state government would put it on a ballot. What you see in that picture is container after container after container of petitions, of signatures after signatures after signatures, of people saying, yes, I want Proposition 114 on the 2020 ballot. I want to vote on this idea. We needed 124,632 signatures. That's the number that you see off to the right-hand side. We collected 215,370. In other words, we blew right past the minimum number of 124 and some change and settled in at 215 and change. We did this on purpose. We blew well past the minimum number of signatures needed to affirm the proposition for the ballot, because we thought if we do that, if we make clear this tremendous support for the idea, we might find that state legislators in early 2020 would do our job for us. So we collect all these signatures in 2019, anticipating that the Colorado General Assembly will convene itself in the first few months of 2020, and they'll do the job of lawmaking. We thought, holy mackerel, maybe we can avoid a long, expensive, divisive statewide campaign on behalf of Proposition 114 by getting the legislature to do it for us. But we were successful. This notion gave rise to Senate Bill 121, which you see at the bottom of the slide. Senate Bill 121 was going to do everything that Proposition 114 proposed. Without a statewide campaign, without millions of dollars spent, we could have been ahead of schedule and under budget because of Senate Bill 121. Right before it was to be introduced. And we knew we had sufficient support for passage, and we knew Governor Polis would sign a passed bill into law. We were on the cusp of avoiding a very, very difficult statewide campaign that comes with no guarantees, mind you. We were on the cusp with Senate Bill 121 when the pandemic settled in. And by the time the General Assembly was able to consider Senate Bill 121, because of the pandemic, the legislators all went home. Because of the pandemic, Senate Bill 121 never saw the light of day. So by May of 2020, we realized, well, that didn't work. So we've got to go back and push forward through an expensive, uncertain statewide campaign to pass Proposition 114. So we built a campaign, which meant TV commercials, for example. So here are 2 or 3 the TV commercials to see. I want you to see how we presented this to the voting public, how we presented this campaign in support of the idea of wolf restoration.
Gray wolves roamed North America for almost 1 million years, but sadly, 7 decades ago, Colorado's last wolf howled its last howl. Today, science tells us that reintroducing wolves across western Colorado's 17 million acres of public lands will begin the process of restoring the balance of nature. Don't we owe it to our future generations to bring them home? Vote yes on 114. Isn't it time we rely on science? This year, we have the chance to restore the natural balance to Colorado by taking politicians out of the picture and directing Colorado Parks and Wildlife to develop a science-based plan that safely reintroduces around 40 wolves across our 17 million acres of public lands. We can restore that critical missing howl to our ecosystems. Isn't that a sensible plan? Vote yes on 114. Proposition 114? A science-based plan to safely reintroduce around 40 wolves to western Colorado's public lands, and it compensates ranchers for any losses. Let's restore the balance. Yes on 114.
So, as you watch these videos, be mindful. The language has been very carefully chosen. The language was poll tested. We knew, for example, the notion of restoring the balance mattered. We knew, for example, that just referencing the number of wolves that would be reintroduced was important because 40, 50 wolves is a smallish number. We didn't bother to point out that the 40 or 50, when successful, would give rise to a population that included 200, 300, 400 wolves. 40 or 50 is an easier number for people to get their head around. We knew from poll testing that Coloradans were motivated by a female biologist. So Dr. Lambert, who you saw in the videos, fits that bill perfectly. We also knew that Coloradans were mindful of the importance of the livestock industry, and they expected that ranchers would be respected in the process of wolf restoration and management. The commercials that you see were very carefully designed based on a lot of reliable information that we collected to strike just the right chord with the voting public.
Restoring wolves in Colorado is a basic value of Colorado heritage. I mean, wolves have always been here. It's natural to this ecosystem, and by restoring wolves to Colorado in a managed way, a conscious way, we can do it in a way that's intelligent, that's going to benefit the wolves and people.
At the end of the day, when the dust finally settled on all of this, 3,123,329 votes were cast. 50.9% of those said yes, 49.1% said no. It was a vote differential of, I want to say, about 53,000 votes on the yes side. In other words, it was a thin win, but, a thin win is a win. But you might fairly ask, gee whiz, Mike, with all of the support that you thought you had, why at the end of it all was this election so very tight? And I think there's several good answers to that. First, the pandemic confused people. Coloradans, let me back up. For the vote to be this close, from all the polling data we had, you have to conclude that a lot of people that supported the wolf's return voted no on the proposition. So why would they do that? Why would wolf supporters vote no? Well, we knew that the pandemic had confused people. They were confused and unsure and concerned about the state's budget. And so they said to themselves, I really want wolves to be restored, but we can't afford it right now. The pandemic certainly had an effect. It also mattered that in early 2020, out of nowhere, 6 gray wolves showed up in the far northwestern part of Colorado. This allowed people to say, oh, gee whiz, Mike, we don't need to reintroduce. They're showing up on their own. Just let it be. Well, what added to that was then a few months later, in the summer of 2020, a puppy showed up. Holy mackerel, Mike, not only are they showing up, they're having puppies. We don't need to reintroduce, they're going to do it on their own. I'm going to vote no. I like wolves, but I'm going to vote no. They're doing it on their own. Not long after that, we learned 3 wolves of the 6 had been lured into Wyoming, apparently, and shot. Holy mackerel. So some people said, oh my gosh, Mike, I really like wolves, but I got to vote no. They deserve better than the fates they will experience with the knuckleheads of western Colorado. They're going to shoot them. My gosh. It mattered that during the height of the campaign, we got outspent 2-1. Now you might say, well, Mike, why did you manage the money that way? Be mindful, we started this campaign in 2014. We were 6 years in by the time August, September, October of 2020 rolled around. We planned all along to spend almost all of our money to get to that point, establish such a big lead that the other side could not catch up. And they didn't, even though they outspent us in the last few weeks of the campaign, magnifying these issues I just pointed out. Oh my gosh, there's wolves here, don't need to let them go. They outspent us 2-1. That mattered. And then finally, as luck would have it, during the height of the campaign, the federal government said, oh my gosh, gray wolves in the United States are no longer in need of federal protection. They have been recovered. And we will act on that decision in early 2021. That allowed wolf supporters to say, well, gosh, Mike, they're doing okay elsewhere. We really don't need them in Colorado. They're no longer endangered. They're no longer threatened. The federal government just said so. The federal government's vision was off, and the vision has since been set aside, but nonetheless, it gave supporters yet another reason to say, I like wolves, but we have more important things to do. They're not even endangered any longer under federal law. I'm going to vote no. I think all of those reasons contribute to the thin win. But the fact is, A thin win is a win. And the state of Colorado has not denied the restoration mandate that was affirmed by 50.9% of the votes saying yes. Here is what has happened. Since the vote, the state of Colorado, as portrayed by the left-hand portion of this slide, they have begun diligently assembling a wolf restoration and management plan. I am honored to say that they invited me and I accepted the opportunity to serve on what amounts to a science advisory board to make sure that the restoration and management plan is the best that it can be. I am confident the state of Colorado will honor the reintroduction mandate that indicates that wolves have to be released. The reintroduction phase has to begin by 31 December 2023. They have yet another about year and a half to get all the details squared away so they can begin conservation translocations of gray wolves by the end of December 2023. Almost certainly what the state of Colorado intends is to translocate wolves from the northern Rocky Mountain states like Wyoming into Colorado. This is a really good idea because many of those animals would otherwise be killed in Wyoming or Montana or Idaho. Why not give a handful, 30, 40, 50, 60 animals, why not give them a new lease on life? Governor Jared Polis is a keen supporter of this effort. He is up for re-election in 2022. If he is re-elected, he fully intends to ensure that wolf restoration goes forward successfully and is already making very obvious moves to use the momentum of wolf restoration to advance the restoration of the wolverine in western Colorado. That's the image you see in the bottom hand portion of this slide. Western Colorado possesses extensive suitable habitat for the wolverine, and from the wolf and wolverine, it's just a small step to imagining someday, maybe someday the great bear, maybe someday the grizzly bear will find its way back to western Colorado as well. The Southern Rockies Wolf Restoration Project was our most audacious effort. It took us 25 years to pull it off, but we did pull it off. And it stands as the first example in the United States of exercising direct democracy to secure a restoration mandate for an imperiled species, something that we're deeply proud of. As I said at my start, Ignacio's curious about the Yellowstone circumstance, and so just very quickly, some comments. The Yellowstone Wolf Project, as I said, has been a wild success, but recently, because of changing political sensibilities, now Montana and Idaho both have very, very, very liberal killing regulations for gray wolves in the states. These liberal regulations allow for a great deal of needless killing based on the ridiculous, misguided premise that wolf numbers need to be reduced significantly in the state of Montana and Idaho, for example. That is not true. There are no data to support that claim, no data whatsoever. The aim of our work was never to restore gray wolves to Yellowstone National Park. The aim was to do reintroductions, conduct conservation translocations in the park where it was highly protected, highly suitable habitat, as a means for restoring a population to the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The ecosystem itself is much, much bigger than the park. Depending on how you want to define it, the ecosystem might extend across 15 to 20 million acres. The park itself is only 2.2 million acres. So the aim was to use the park as the birthing grounds for a wolf population that would eventually settle much bigger country. Those are the wolves that are being persecuted because of this very ugly turn in political sensibilities that allow for a raft of absolute needless killing. The animals in the park are still relatively secure, especially those that never leave the park. There are some park animals that do spend some time outside the park, and it is known to some. And this past winter, I believe over 20 wolves were killed, for all intent and purposes, immediately after they stepped outside the park. I'm glad Ignacio asked the question. The biological answer, I think the park population is going to be fine, but it still is a raft of ugly, needless killing that should stop. In closing, I just want to offer 4 admonitions to conservation translocation practitioners. Thank you for listening to this video. Again, I'm sorry that I'm not there in person. I hope Grizzly Creek Films has put this together in a manner that you enjoy watching, but that's the burden that they face when I finish. But the admonitions. Acknowledge that stories matter more than data. People aren't compelled by data. They're compelled by stories. It's great if you can wrap your story on a foundation of reliable information, good science, for example. But I think it's foolish to imagine that good science will set us free. If that was the case, we would never be all bound up as we are today. We need good stories and we need good storytellers, and I hope that you're willing to rise to that challenge. The second admonition, as conservation translocation practitioners, you should never forget that the most important currency of our success is more life in the wild. When in doubt, let them go. Letting them go, achieving progress in the field, is far more important than anything else we do. More important than giving a talk, more important than writing a paper. The currency of success that matters most for us as conservation translocation practitioners is more life in the wild. When in doubt, let them go. The third admonition, save everything. I chose this picture of this young meadow vole on purpose. We have to rise up beyond the charismatic species of gray wolves, for example, or Rocky Mountain elk, or elephants or jaguars. We have to rise above the charismatic species and speak on behalf of those other inhabitants of this great planet that have no voice. Save everything. And finally, be urgent with your work. Above all else, approach every day with urgency. The extinction crisis grows more severe with each passing day. Given our great intellectual and physical might, there is no doubt that we now rule over the biosphere as gods. As such, the future of life is ours to choose if we act now. Otherwise, time remains an undefeatable foe. And you know why this is? Because if we lose the meadow vole, if we lose the Mexican wolf, we lose the bolson tortoise, another heaven and earth and a great deal of time and a whole bunch of luck would have to all come together for the bolson tortoise to rise again. For imperiled species all over the world, time is not our friend. Creation is a marvel, and no matter who you are, it should matter. And you need to make that known to everybody with a degree of urgency. Let's just assume for a moment that you're a person of faith. How can you love the Creator and not love the creation? And how can you love something and yet stand by and watch it needlessly destroyed without rising up in defense? Or let's assume that you're a secular humanist and that you believe, rather than faith, it's science and data and logic and empiricism that matter most. The best science says, without doubt, the fate of humanity has been and will always be inextricably tied to the health of local landscapes the world over. And yet, the extinction crisis makes clear these landscapes are not the least bit healthy. Approach each day with an urgency to deliver the message that restoration is an alternative to extinction. Thank you so much for listening. Ignacio, again, pal, thank you for letting me contribute from afar. I wish I was there in person, but I am there in spirit. Thank you so much.
So, Charles, I have here some images about the Hawaiian monk seal program. I think the idea is to just to comment on this and connect it with your experience of the Hawaiian seal program. I know that we are a little short with time, but just relax. we'll manage it. I mean, because he took a lot of time and we had some delay, but I think I want to hear from how you connect both things and how important these translocations were for this recovery.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and I'll start the same place that you did before. Ignacio, thank you for having us here and pulling this all together. I think it's a great success so far, and the idea of moving away from scientific presentations to sharing stories has, it's just been great so far to hear all this. And this is that's a hard presentation to follow in terms of storytelling. I'll start just a little bit about background for Hawaiian monk seals, just so we have a little bit of context on the experiences we've had and the challenges that we've faced. Hawaiian monk seals are, by their name, only found in Hawaii. Population has been in decline for decades, at least since the 1950s, we believe. And like most of our species, they are under threat from a variety of, it's a death by 1,000 cuts, a variety of threats to their survival, food limitation, predation, fisheries interactions, and the like, have driven them to quite low numbers. And the lowest was around 1,100 animals, and then just this year we have announced that they've broken 1,500 and have shown recovery, population growth of about 2% per year since 2013. So heading in the right direction, but quite a ways to go. Did you want me to just launch into sort of some of those challenges, some of the stories?
Kind of how important was translocations, I mean, for the recovery, how relevant it was, and then the challenges associated with translocations, yeah.
Translocation is probably our most commonly used tool and probably the most important. A lot of the presentations today have been about that formal reintroduction into different parts of animals' historic range. That is the one of the only versions of translocation that we have not done yet. So we have been lucky that monk seals are spread across the Hawaiian archipelago, which many of you are probably familiar with the main Hawaiian islands, which is Honolulu and where all the people live, and they are high islands. But the entire archipelago stretches 2,400 kilometers, and there are about 8 islets and atolls that are the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, which is a giant marine protected area made of about 8 subpopulations. So it is a network of subpopulations within the metapopulation. We've not had to reintroduce animals, but we have used translocations to tackle many of the threats that we've had. So we have a situation, there'll be a slide that will come through at some point where you'll see a lot of seals on top of each other. We have an issue within monk seals of male aggression, where whether it is an individual male attacking young animals, pups of the year, or 2, 3, 4, 25, 30 males that are going after trying to copulate with a single female. Both those situations quite often end in injury or death to either our young seals, in particular we're worried about the young females, or more profoundly, that multiple male aggression, the death of adult females. So translocation for that is removing the animal or those animals that are the threat. So we will, for the individual male, we don't want them in the population, so we've historically moved them to places where other monk seals aren't, because if you move that behavior, it just follows the seal, or we move them into captivity. But for the multiple male aggression, if you disperse those animals, the extreme example was at a population called Laysan. We had a population skewed towards males of 2 males for every female, probably one of the primary drivers for this aggression. We moved, I think, 34 animals over the course of several years, translocated them to other places within their range, and virtually eliminated that problem, saving many reproductive females' lives. But for food limitation, we can look at our demographic data and we can see where young animals are starving. Basically, in some locations, if you'll struggle up to 2 or 3 years of age to get enough food. Once you become subadult or an adult, it's pretty much equal across the population. So we can translocate young females, like in a photo like this, while they are still fat from recently weaning. we can take them, knowing that the chances of survival are incredibly low, move them to another population where, based on our demographic and population trends, we know that the survival is much higher, and drop them off there, maintaining that reproductive potential for the overall population. And then our more sophisticated scenarios would then take those females back to their initial population in order to have them start to breed. So we may not have necessarily resolved some of the food limitation issues, but we are maintaining the capacity of those populations to sustain themselves, waiting for the ecosystem to turn more favorably. And we manage a lot of human-seal conflict in the main Hawaiian Islands with translocations, again, trying to keep those wild animals wild. So we have pups that are born on Waikiki Beach, our most popular tourist beach. And the mom will wean them after 6 weeks. And so once they're alone and looking to start to socialize and to learn social cues and those sorts of things, having them surrounded by hundreds of thousands of tourists is probably not going to be particularly conducive to their remaining wild. And so we will, at that point, translocate them based on a variety of criteria to areas where they're going to encounter other seals, where there's a reduction in human conflict, where there's a less likelihood of interactions with fisheries, and again, in order to fend off conflict or problem seals in the future and keeping them wild. So of the maybe 12 or so activities we do or threats we try to mitigate, a vast majority of those have some form of translocation related to them.
So what challenges that you had to face, the main ones, and how you face them, and recommendations for the people?
Yeah, you know, I mean, I think the one thing I will take home from this meeting and other translocation meetings is we all share the same story, just told slightly differently. The challenges are very similar, maybe different proportions. I guess I'll start with opportunities, just
okay.
Because the population did lend itself, and maybe it puts the challenges into context as to how difficult they were. Probably the first issue was our animals were not sexy. They were cute, but they still were able to be kind of that charismatic nature, served them well in getting people to support them. We do have a single country and a single state, so that government-to-government negotiation that quite often needs to happen, transboundary animals, we didn't have to deal with that. We did have a strong legal mandate, as was discussed in the previous presentation. We have the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act in particular that compels the government, theoretically, to do its recovery. I throw on my glasses so I can read what I wrote. And we had great data. The population had been monitored since the 1980s. There had been a variety of recovery activities that happened over the years, but we didn't really start to get involved with very intensive recovery until the 2000s. But we had amazing population data from across the range that allowed us to be pretty creative and strategic in the types of interventions we were going to do. But probably the most important thing is I work for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. We have the primary mandate for recovering monk seals, and we had amazing resources. Particularly in the last 10 to 15 years, we've had significant funding to recover monk seals. We have a fleet of large white research vessels to move us around the chain. So there was a lot of backing for us to be able to do what we need to do. And so highlighting all of that, basically the conclusion is we actually had no excuse to fail. If conservation was going to work, much of what the challenges that other groups face, we were very luckily free of. But there still were challenges. I think was talked in a couple of other presentations, the culture of fear that we had was a struggle. We lacked creativity being the federal government, but there had been some setbacks previously that caused people to not want to engage in recovery. That it was better to watch them slip away than to act. Once you act, you had to own it. And so success or failure, there just wasn't a great will from our higher leadership to step out on that limb to try to save the animals. There was one of our people on our recovery team, a very excellent population biologist who quoted at one of our recovery team meetings that this would possibly be the most well-documented extinction on the planet because we knew so much about the population, we knew all the individuals, but we would watch them go down the drain. And so the bureaucracy was an issue, even though theoretically we were all supposed to be working in one cause in one direction. We had a very motivated group within our research program and some of our outside partners that wanted to do great things, but trying to get our own permits. We work for the agency that permits these activities. We are the permitting group, and trying to convince ourselves to give us a permit to do this was a challenge. And a lot of the problem was that a lot of the people in the permit office, or a couple of them, had been part of the monk seal program historically and had been part of those failures. And they didn't know how much we'd evolved and how science-driven we were at the time and protocol-driven, and had really stepped up our game. And so we had to do so much convincing to get them on board that we weren't the monk seal program of the past. Eventually we were successful. And then the last big challenge, and bureaucracy stretched between our other partner agencies, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we had challenges with. The state of Hawaii, we had some challenges with, but I think most of those have been overcome. But it was a decade or two of trying to get there. But public perception was a real struggle. Historically, monk seals were only in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. They reintroduced themselves to the main Hawaiian Islands after being extinct for probably 8 centuries or so. And you just had generations of people, in particularly locals, native Hawaiians and a lot of the local fishing community that had grown up with no monk seals. And a lot of our work was trying to build a culture of coexistence for monk seals to continue their return to the main Hawaiian Islands. And there was just the same myths and misperceptions that everybody has when you're bringing a predator into an environment. The concerns that monk seals would eat everything and that they would destroy the reef and fishermen wouldn't be able to fish. And so, and we were very poor at communicating. And so we did see resistance to some of our recoveries, in particular 2-stage translocations, where we would move animals, young animals from the northwestern Hawaiian Islands to the main Hawaiian Islands to take advantage of, it's very counterintuitive, monk seals were doing badly in this remote protected area, but they were doing incredibly well where all the people were destroying the environment. And the animals were bigger, they were fatter, they were reproducing earlier in the main Hawaiian Islands. Population was skyrocketing relative to the northwest. So we wanted to take those young animals down to the main Hawaiian Islands, fatten them up in a nursery, and then after a year or two bring them back up to the northwestern Hawaiian Islands. And there was so much public resistance, we had to let that tool go in order to we'd lose that fight, but to ultimately win the war, and it just was very obvious that we needed to engage more. So those were our big challenges. Should I keep going? Lessons learned? Did you want to jump in and say anything?
If you want to conclude with some lessons or advice, I mean, you're doing great.
Oh, thanks.
It's a difficult situation. You are sweating, but you are surviving. Yeah.
And so lessons learned. This is very much, as we would say, preaching to the choir. I think we've all learned these lessons, and some of them the hard way. Engaging more and engaging earlier. I think that is probably, we have amazing external partners now with NGOs and other groups that we didn't have early on. And I think the one problem, the previous presentation is a good one. We're terrible communicators at the U.S. federal government, at least. We're uncomfortable inspiring emotion and connection to animals and telling a good story. And in Hawaii, it's not just telling the story and communicating it, it's being the right storyteller. So particularly dealing with the indigenous population, who has a lot of resentment to the US federal government. For so long, it was me or other people that looked like me, white male scientists with PhDs going and talking to local fishermen or cultural practitioners or other folks. And so we had good data. I think at times we had good stories, but we had the wrong storytellers, and that was a lesson that we didn't learn for a really long time. And so I think it is engaging early and to Mike's point from the previous thing is getting the right storytellers to get on board and to share the message. And with that, to be really transparent. There was a lot of fear and there was a lot of myths. There were some problems. There was going to be real conflict. And to not avoid those hard conversations, but just making sure that everybody understands what you're getting into. Building the partnerships obviously is important, but that within those partnerships, what almost doomed our recovery efforts in the 1990s was a lack of protocols and a lack of building or clear protocols that we followed, and a lack of resilience to failures. So we had a pretty significant issue with some animals that we had brought in for rehabilitation, all went blind. We couldn't release them, and it shut down conservation action for monk seals for a decade or more. And there just wasn't a stomach for failure. And it took a lot of work to get that machine moving again. And I think so one of the things that we've learned now is being very clear about the risk. All we ever do is risk assessment now. We do act urgently, we do push the envelope, and we are trying to be creative, but it is making sure that people know there are going to be failures, that with these bold endeavors, something is bound to go wrong at some point, and you need to learn from them, you need to evolve, and you need to move on, which gets back to our biggest thing is our mantra in our program is just protocols, protocols, protocols. Every action that we take has, and I know this is pushed by the Conservation Translocation Specialist Group, and everything they're well thought out, they are defensible, and they give you a clear recipe if something goes wrong to be able to break out, where did it go wrong, how can we evolve that? And it gives great confidence to the partners that you have. It's a clear demonstration of how well that you've thought this out, and I know all of you work with probably great protocols, but it's just probably our most important tool. And I think I will stop there. I've got a few other things, but for the sake of time, or if there are other questions or comments.
Thank you so much. I mean, I know it was difficult, you were in a difficult situation, but I think you did an amazing summary, of so many years of experience. So thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Astrid, do you feel like talking about the black-footed ferret in a few minutes?
Very short.
Do you feel okay with that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
And thank you for your patience, because I think there's lots of experience here. I think even if we have a little less time for lunch, yes, we just give it a try.
Yeah, and I know everybody's tired, so I'm going to get up. And if you feel like getting up, I think that brings more energy to the... Yes, it's a good idea, ¿verdad? So the ferrets, extinct in the wild twice, 81, and then it was, oh, no, don't put me there. Just put the ferrets.
Okay,
yes,
okay,
thank you. Okay, that's better. So cute, maybe not sexy, but like Mickey Mouse, which is a very important thing in the United States. So that was our strength. We had an animal that was an amazing, crazy story of extinction, and suddenly it reappeared like out of the blue in Metitsi. They were brought into captivity. This was 1991. And here we're dealing with a critically endangered as you can get. I mean, there were 10 animals left in the whole world. And it's good that Carl Jones then is going to talk about the Mauritius kestrel, which is a similar story of like, just give up. What are you going to do with so few animals? It's like, no, me estoy enrollando. Espera, más cortito. Okay, next one. So here we're talking again about a keystone species, the black-footed flagship species, an umbrella species that is highly depending on its keystone species, which is the prairie dog, which, as Mike said, by the way, Mike is a genius, as you have. It's so sad not to have him here, because it would be amazing. But anyways, he's here in spirit, so let's celebrate that too. So prairie dogs, highly, absolutely hated. And I think they are cute, but for some reason, they just don't have the pull of these other species. So they've been decimated by the millions. They occupied 100 million hectares across the western plains from Saskatchewan in Canada to Chihuahua in Mexico. Now there's only 2% of their habitat left due to poisoning campaigns. They've been poisoned to death, and sylvatic plague, the Black Death of the Middle Ages. Again, another epidemic, episodic, that has really blasted these poor animals that have been exposed to this bacteria for only 100 years. So they are highly susceptible. There not been a lot of time for them to adapt to this. So next one. So basically, keystone and flagships. So what happened there? This is a map of the historical range of the black-footed ferret, mostly black-tailed prairie dogs, gunnison and white-tailed prairie dogs. What Mike was talking about is reintroduction site. It's not here yet. It wasn't there yet. Anyway, so black-footed ferret breeding program starting in '88. There were 18 ferrets. Only 7 of them managed to pass their genes on to the population. So highly inbred, but luckily not inbreeding depression. There's a little bit of inbreeding depression, but not brutal. So that was lucky and good. Reintroduction started in 1991. We started to release by the state of Wyoming. And Wyoming said, okay, we're going to release them only in Wyoming for a little while. A little bit like with the links in Andalusia. It's like only Wyoming, and 3 years of reintroduction in Wyoming. It was going okay, but we really needed to get them out. Like Mike said, if in doubt, get them out as much as you can. So luckily, in 1994, we had a new recovery coordinator, a man of vision and incredible leadership. And that was amazing for the black-footed ferret. And he came with a vision. We're going to reintroduce black-footed ferrets. Our recovery goal is to have 3,000 in the wild, at least in 10 populations, with 30 breeding females in each population. Very clear goals. And we're going to get a lot of breeding, and we're going to get up and keep going because we have a clear goal. So reintroduction started. And right there you have from 1991 to 2011, and the idea is put them out in as many places as you want, provided that there's good populations of prairie dogs, and suddenly, wow, this is a success. We've been reintroducing them for 20 years. There are 19 populations. There are more than 1,000 black-footed ferrets in the wild. This is going guay. Está muy bien. Está guay del Paraguay, como se dice en español. Well, so what happened next? Next, more reintroductions happened, and then plague hit really hard, and also we learned that ferrets not only susceptible to canine distemper, but also to sylvatic plague. That means if plague is in a town and you have ferrets there, they are going to die of plague as well, which is terrible. So then what else? Drought. Heavy drought. That's what caused the extinction of the ferrets in the Turner lands. Basically, there's no grass for prairie dogs. And this is what I'm saying a little bit about the Iberian lynx. I think we need to learn a lot from this. 1,000 ferrets, we think it's really going great, it's a success, and suddenly it's like, whew, cataploof. So there's been more than 10,000 animals born in captivity, 5,000 reintroduced right now. There's 32 reintroduction sites and only 300 ferrets in the wild. 300. So that's not a lot. And it's a challenge, but there's hope, and then I'm sure that we can turn all this around because we know how to control plague and how to control prairie dogs. So one thing about the vision of Pete is think about all these sites like a Christmas trees with lights that come and go. And this has happened with a black-footed ferret. Suddenly they come extinct in one side, and 5 years later, some of them re-emerge, like prairie dogs as well. So some of them are kind of resistant somehow, and those are the ones you really want to invest on. So what's happening here is we have 32 reintroduction sites. When we started with that vision in 1991, when Pete came in, it was 94, he said, your job, actually, he hired me, which I was a young girl from Spain. They thought I was Mexican because in the States, anybody that speaks with a Spanish accent is Mexican. So this young Mexican girl, what is she going to do having the breeding program? That was very audacious, working with, just choosing me was kind of crazy. But anyways, he said, I trust you, I'm going to invest in you, and when you need an asshole, call me. So it's like, you don't be an asshole, you just do your work, but when you need somebody to fight, just call me. And that was his vision. He really trusted his team. That was very important. So I think that there's so many lessons to be learned from the black-footed ferrets, and one is like, never put down your guard. Things around the corner are there, and be watchful. I think it's worth to remember the 4 things that Mike have said, which are so important, and they also, like you've said as well. The first of all is we need good stories. Good stories are essential. And this afternoon, tomorrow, we're gonna listen to some amazing stories from Argentina who are really pros at telling the story of all the rewilding efforts there. It's like, wow, so compelling and emotional. And all of us can tell very good stories, and we need good storytellers. Then, if in doubt, put them out. Look at that. 300 only, like Christmas trees, but they are going to come back. And also, we have a sense of urgency. We are we're being hit by climate change. Now it's in our face. So we really need to work with urgency and with commitment. And also, well, there's a lot of other things to be learned, but one is take advantage of all existing opportunities. Don't say, okay, we'll leave that for tomorrow. No, there's opportunities that need to be grabbed and taken advantage of at all times. So that, I think, it's a very important message. And work with the private sector. In all these programs, we're saying, usually we rely on governments for all this. Oh yeah, it's the government's choice and job. Not true. It's our job as citizens. So private efforts in the Moxie or in the black-footed ferret are essential for the return of this endangered species. And with that, me callo ya. Okay, so thank you.
Muchas gracias.